All right, welcome on back. We're going to head over to Greece, or at least back over to Greece, now that you know who the Persians are, and we're going to talk about some very pivotal series of events for Western civilization. And it's really our first batch of what ifs, and we'll talk about that more as we continue. Now, before we get to the war, I think it's important to understand a few things about Greek military technology and organization. That really comes down to the unit of soldiers called the phalanx. A phalanx is a military formation in which a soldier known as a hoplite lines up in close proximity to one another, and a hoplite goes down the line, and they lock their shields together and make essentially a human wall, as you can see on the painted pot in the slide here. And they basically create this marching formation, shield, and then they have, step by step in close proximity. They speed up the pace, and the closer they get to the enemy, before eventually colliding with them. And then you can see that the leader here, later on they have their spears up high, and sometimes you see them with their spears protruding, kind of battle shield wall. And this is actually a really terrifying and effective tactic in ancient warfare, and they're not really a good way to counter this when they're well trained enough and they stick close enough together and move at a rapid pace. So this is starting around, start perfecting this around 700 BC. By the time we get to the war with the Persians, the Greeks are awfully good at this. And you can see the soldier on the right. You can kind of see his basic equipment, his helmet here, which is sort of iconic and rather famous. And then they don't have a breastplate. And then you have the greaves here. And note that the thighs are not covered because they want to be able to move quickly. And the shield basically covers that part anyway. So it's a very effective tactic. Now, I should add that this pottery, this one comes from around 650. So like I said, they start to seem to perfect it around 700. We start seeing it used and in depictions. And it's really part of a real cultural value and artistic sensibility around 650. But I want you to understand a few more things about it. Crucially, it is not a tactic of war designed for mass killing. In fact, it's relatively low number of casualties occur in battles when the phalanx is facing another phalanx. The idea is to destroy the morale of the enemy by having your opposition leave the battlefield, realizing that they can't break through your shield because you're just too good at it. Forget it. Fine, you win. We'll retreat. So, of course, that sometimes involves a lot of killing, but oftentimes it does not. The most effective group at this, I'm sure you've heard of them, is the Spartans. Of course, we have them recorded as showing up with enough phalanx formation. They perform a bunch of fancy maneuvers and show off all their training, and they're basically totally obsessed with this stuff. And then they're able to demonstrate in these sort of marches that it's so intimidating and precise that it freaks out their opponents, who actually withdraw before they even fight them. So their reputation literally precedes them, and they show off a bit and they win battles occasionally without even any bloodshed. So again, it's meant to destroy their morale. And what makes a good soldier in this type of fighting is not the one that kills the most enemies, but the one who holds his ground, or the one who does not desert the battlefield. And also, you don't want to be too brave either. If you run ahead, you're a bad soldier just as much as you are if you run away, because it's all about unity and the formation, and it's very effective. Now let's pick up the pace a little bit. We get to the war itself. The Persian War and the Greeks actually start right here in Ionia. All right? In Ionia. And this is a group that we talked about back with the Greek philosophy a little bit. Thales of Miletus was from here, the guy that we talked about, everything being made of water, and the Ionians rebel against the Persians. Now remember, in the last lecture, we talked about how the Persians had lost their perspective when it came to tolerance, and the thing that made their empire great under Cyrus and Cambyses was their tolerance and respect for other people and cultures. Well, by the later part of the Darius' reign, we start to lose that a bit, and by Xerxes' reign, it's completely gone. So the Ionian Greeks are one of those groups that rebel because of the change in treatment, and the Persians and the Ionian Greeks go to war in about 500 BC. Super easy date to remember. 10 years later, the Persians have finally ended that rebellion. So, a 10-year rebellion in terms of, finally ending it. And Darius shows up with his army. It's over pretty quickly. It's more like he can't decide what he wants to do. Then he makes a crucial mistake, okay? The Ionians rebel eventually. That's dealt with. Darius shows up to deal with it pretty quickly, and he decides that he should punish Athens for helping the Ionian Greek colonies. And so Darius invades Greece in 490, and that's kind of our turning point. And it really begins on paper, and it's a serious mismatch. The Persians supposedly have roughly 100,000 troops to the Greeks roughly having 20,000, and it's mostly Athenians. So sometimes I'll refer to them as Athenians as well, just because. But there are other Greeks there. Well, surprisingly, for a variety of factors, the Greeks end up doing pretty well. And this is a sketch from the Battle of Marathon and actually this is from Life magazine in 1901. And it just kind of shows you that it's still considered to be very crucial to civilization as late as 1901. And Life magazine was a very popular, circulation. So it kind of throws up that the Athenian army was very well trained, and despite being outnumbered greatly, they had the advantage of picking the land and being well trained, and they picked a plateau that was narrow enough that the Persian numerical advantage would be difficult to bring to bear. It's not enough space for all those Persians, and that helps a lot. But in the army, to have that many, it helps to have that many. But in this series of events, it really doesn't. So as the Athenians charge the Persian lines and in the phalanx formation, it surprises the Persian army, and they actually end up running from the Athenians. And there's the Greek phalanx being effective right there. In fact, believe it or not, it's a slaughter in the other direction. The Athenian army almost drive the Persians back into the sea. And according to Greek historians, we got to remember that, the Greeks win here. So the sources that we have are from the Greek language, of course, and it survived. But there's a bunch of reasons that the Greek sources are going to say, be biased or whatever. But I don't think they're making this up. The final tally ends up being like 6,400 Persians dead, 192 Athenians. And, it'd be, that's not that big. I mean, 6,000 out of 100,000 doesn't seem like a big deal. So maybe there's something to do with the amount of Persians initially there. But you can see 100,000 would be easily exaggerated. But the point is, the Athenians win a great battle, no matter how you slice it. And Darius never actually goes back to Greece. He says, okay, well, we're not doing that again. So after the battle, the Persians get in their ships, and the Athenians don't know what they're intending. So they send a man named Philippides to run from the plateau of Marathon all the way back to Athens, which is the distance of about 26 miles. And he gets back to Athens. He says, hey, the Persians are coming. And he goes back and warns them, and he says, get ready, the Persians are going to come and attack, and he kills over and dies. And so I don't know why we continue to run marathons after the first person that did it died, but either way, the Persians don't end up attacking Athens at that time. It just kind of, there's no way of knowing what they're going to do, so they wanted to warn them, and at the end of the day, it's a much bigger win for the Athenians than they initially thought. And there's much more to the story, but we don't have really time to get into all of that. But I do want to note that one thing that does happen, because we won't get into it fully in the next lecture, and that's the Spartans. They don't actually fight in the Battle of Marathon. They're busy with a religious festival, right? And they're not going to break their tradition with this festival just to come to help the Athenians. And so, needless to say, there's going to be some hard feelings about that, but then we're going to fast forward another 10 years. So we had 500, the Ionians, 490 Marathon, and then 10 years later is the second big invasion. And that's going to take place in 480 BC under Xerxes. So the Greeks may be small in number, but they're not anywhere near as powerful as the Persians. Well, the Persians are going, hey, we're an empire, and the Greeks can fight, and they're better, but we're huge, right? So they're going to come back and be much better prepared. And I think the Persians are. I mean, you see here where this is kind of circled here. They decide we're going to go up this way. We're not going to make the same mistake. We're going to go up this way. And so you can kind of see here that there's this point that's not connected at Hellespont. And what they do is they actually build a bridge using all the boats in his fleet to be able to cross across this with his army. And there's a bit of an island and peninsula there where there's less water to cross, and so they basically cross with their ships. They make a bridge, which is really, really, crazy, a marvel of innovation. And they come from the north where Darius sailed straight over, but that's too predictable. And they don't forget the Greeks that are kind of the masters of the sea, and so he goes through Thrace and Macedonia, and he actually gets allies. The Macedonians fight on the side of the Persians. Then he swoops back down from the north to the south into Greece. And it's really important. So we end up here at this point with a battle with the Spartans at a place called Thermopylae. And we'll get to that war just in a second. But first, we need to really understand about the Spartans. Now, you're going to have a whole reading on the Spartans, but the Spartans, is a military state, par excellence in the ancient world. They are basically the greatest warriors in the ancient world. From the time a young man is born until he's old, he's basically training in military stuff all the way from the age of 7. He goes to a full-on military school where they're encouraged to go barefoot, and they only get one garment of clothing, and they do all this stuff to make them tough and able to withstand conditions when they're at war, because they realize that in order to win, they have to condition from a young age. And part of me thinks, man, like, that's kind of messed up. But, you can kind of read that and kind of get your own opinion. And I don't want to spoil it for you, but they are a major military state to a degree that we can't even fathom. That's the value they place on being skilled in battle. And again, not necessarily individual bravery or valor, although that is part of it. It's about fighting as a phalanx unit and being kind of this perfect team that does not yield and doesn't give ground, where each man takes care of the person next to him. And it's kind of made famous, I suppose. We kind of, about 20 years ago now, maybe 15, 20 years almost, the movie 300 depicts the Spartans in all their glory. And, it kind of shows them as this really militant group, but it's really a quaint homeland, honestly. Like, in that movie, you have King Leonidas yelling, like, "This is Sparta." But if you look at it, like, there's Sparta right there. It's pretty small and insignificant compared to some of the other places we've covered here. It's a place where if you're not a hardy individual with a hardy, tough society, you're not going to survive. So that part of it is probably where they got their values, and they also enslaved local populations around them to basically do the farming for them, and they called them the Helots. And they were always worried about the Helots rebelling. So the Spartans, keep pressure on this region and keep getting resources from around them. And it kind of shows you that, they kind of had to do this. And so each city-state kind of ends up with their own niche reputation in Greece. Like Athens is like the thinkers and artists and democracy, and they can fight okay, but Sparta really gets the reputation of being the expert military. And they definitely had that. So when the Persians come back with a bigger army and a bigger invasion, it's really important that we understand that the Greeks get the Spartans to participate. And although they didn't fight at Marathon, they do fight at Thermopylae. So the Persians meet the Greeks at Thermopylae, so it's the Spartans plus some other Greeks, and I don't want you to think it was only the Spartans, but the movie kind of makes you think that it was. But there are other Greeks, and it's a very small mountain pass. The Greeks deliberately chose that because they knew that there was only so many, routes from the north. So the Persians are going to walk right to where the Greeks are waiting, and for 2 days, 7,000 Greeks hold the Persians back, and that's really going to buy the rest of the Greeks time. It's a quick example of where we're at here. If you look at this from the top-down plan, the Persians have come through here, and it's all wilderness and rocky terrain, and it's not something a big army can move through. So, the Greeks know they're going to have to come along here in this flatter plain along the coast, and it's the only way the Persians can march. So, with all the supplies that they need and all of that. So, it's pretty obvious the Spartans are going to be waiting there for them. And this is, again, the stuff of legend. And the 300 Spartans stay behind. At the end of the day, the rest of the Greeks go back to defend their homelands. And the 300, of course, inspire the fictionalized embellishment account of the movies. But the story is true, broadly speaking. They kind of at least got the big picture right. 300 Spartans historically stay behind, knowing that it means certain death to allow the rest of the Greeks time to escape and prepare their defenses for invasion. Ultimately, the Persians do win the battle, but at tremendous cost. And it's through treachery, because the Persians find that there's another mountain pass through this Greek trader that allows them to kind of surround the Spartans. So even outnumbered with just a few hundred of them, the Spartans still give it a good show, and maybe would have killed even more Persians had they not been betrayed. And this is really what allowed the Persians to pour into Greece, but at a very, very high cost. Now, the next part of the story is no longer in the movie, and I find that people are usually familiar with Thermopylae, and you can cover that quickly. But the rest of this, what happens is just as important, if not more important, in terms of what the Greeks actually do. And so what they do in response to this massive army is that they realize there's no avoiding this war. So the Athenians do something very clever. And this map shows you kind of Thermopylae as a kind of a close-up here. And they work their way down. They're going to go conquer Athens and all of this. Well, the Athenians say, hey, we can't really, it's not easily defensible. It's not a good place to have a siege. The Persians are bringing all of this. So they're going to make this really difficult and fairly remarkable decision to basically abandon their city and find a better ground to fight and come up with a better strategy. Rather than allowing the Persians to besiege Athens, they just give it to them. Which is interesting because it spoils Xerxes' big victory, right? He goes to Athens and it's a bunch of elderly people and people who couldn't leave the city, and there's no fighting for him. And it really hurts his pride. It's supposed to be this big victory, but it's really a joke. He does burn Athens, and the women and children, kind of go and hide in the caves, and the men have retreated on their ships to a place called Salamis. And it's extremely clever by the Greeks. And, there's some senses in the Greek sources that try and hint that they knew Xerxes was going to be angry and irrational, and that he had to be, and if they had a chance of winning. And so by taking his greatest victory from him there in Athens, they basically make it a joke. They have incensed him. They make sure that the Persians see their ships fleeing. And so the Greeks are fleeing and over here to Salamis. And there's this little cove, if you think about like Pirates' Coves or whatever. And the cove, they kind of know this land a lot more. They know the sea currents, and they want the Persians to follow them. And they make sure that they do. And they make sure Xerxes sees it. And he says, hey, go after them, get them, right? They've mocked me, and they've given me this city. They're cowards, right? Go get them. And he's got 100 reasons to do this. And the Persians are quick to follow the retreating Greeks to this island of Salamis. But the Greeks have a number of advantage. And the first thing I want to note is their advantage in ships. So these ships are called trirings because they have three, rollers, to try and, they have 3 rows of rowers. And the idea of these ships are to be designed to be smaller and have a really, really hard front that they can use to ram the Persian ships. And the Athenians knew that after Darius lost, that he would come back, right? After they were defeated, they knew the Persians would eventually come back. And so they decided, we're going to plan for that. They were going to develop these, ships to be nimble and dart in and out and hit and run on these bigger Persian ships and destroy them. And it's brilliant. And these people here that are rowing, they're actually not slaves, like we think of the Roman era, they use the slaves to row. These people are not slaves. These are the lower class citizens of Athens who are actually like defending their homeland. And it's important for you to kind of take note of that. But the Athenians win a humongous naval battle at Salamis and with their navy, and the preparation they did in the years between the 10 years between the Persian invasions allows them to win. And this was come up with a guy by the name of Themistocles, and he wants to build Athens into a major naval power. And so when they leave the city, they've been working on their navy, not their army, because the army is Sparta, right, in the Greeks' case. And so they ram some like 200 Persian ships and only lose like 40 of their own. Xerxes is actually watching the whole battle from a cliff and losing his mind. He's like, how is my massive navy losing to these little pipsqueak ships? And his advisors are like, well, actually, your ships can't move fast enough. These little Greek ships are battering us, and boom, 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 and now they're gone. And so Xerxes loses this huge naval battle in a fit of rage. He throws one of his advisors off the cliff. And right, you don't want to be around Xerxes right now. And so he abandons the campaign. He leaves, and he leaves his head general in charge. He says, hey, stay here and win this war for me. I'm out of here. And he throws a tantrum and runs off. And then there's one final battle at the place called Plataea. And Plataea, the Greeks and Persians finally fight at equal strength. And we've got the Persians outnumbering them this whole point, right? Marathon, it doesn't matter. Thermopylae doesn't matter. I mean, the Persians win, but at a great cost. And they take Athens. The Greeks don't care. They outnumber them at Salamis in the naval battle, but the Athenians win anyways. And now you have Athens and Sparta fighting together and at Plataea, and it's based on the Greek phalanx and strategy and their cleverness and this whole thing. And I don't really have to probably tell you who wins this. The Greek military superiority wins out, and Persia retreats for good. So how did the Greeks do it? Well, they had the defender advantage, right? There's always this point in a war that if you have the home turf, it's an enormous advantage, right? Think about Vietnam. Vietnam goes poorly for the United States because we don't know the jungles, and right? And even though we had more modern technology, the Greeks are just better soldiers, especially in the case of the Spartans. So on land, the military and the Spartans, they've been training for this their whole lives. And the Persian army looks, what are they made of? Well, you've got the immortals. They're kind of the elite bodyguards of the emperor, and they're effective fighters, but most of them are foreign fighters of, different parts of the empire cobbled together, farmers that are basically forced to fight. And they're going up against these highly trained Spartans. And the average Persian soldier is nowhere near as trained or well equipped as the average Greek. And so the numerical advantage amounts to basically nothing. And the Greeks also use better strategy. And what are the long-term outcomes? Well, we're going to get to that here in just a second. The immediate things that come out of this, there's immediate and long-term. Well, one, you have to rebuild Athens, and somebody has to pay for it. So the Athenians feel like they've spent a fortune on this war. They're the ones that really kept Greece safe, so they're actually going to basically enact really harsh tributes on some of their allies, and unfortunately that's going to lead to civil war. And that's the topic for the next lecture. And then ultimately that creates a scenario where Philip and Alexander arrive, and Greece gets easily conquered. The people that held out against the mighty Persian Empire with its 800-mile territory are easily conquered by their down-the-road neighbors to the north because they're so weak. But these events do keep Greece from becoming part of the Persian Empire. They keep Greek freedom and allow them to continue to develop philosophy and democracy, which are really pillars of Western society, and that's why it's so tremendous. Because if the Greeks had been defeated by the Persians, maybe they would have rebelled and thrown them off, 5 years later or whatever, but we don't know. But the fact that they won allows them to create these hallmarks of Western civ, and that they develop there instead of maybe other places later on. And so that really kind of is the outcomes of the Greek-Persian War. And next section, we're going to talk about the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta.